Well, welcome to Mixed Bag Storytelling Swap at Belmont Village on Zoom. This is December 18, 2023. Vicki Ness.
Okay. Um, Let me just hold on, do something here and excuse me. Okay. Once there was a deep, dark forest that rolled up a very steep hill to a ridge line of ragged treetops, and the whole affair cascaded down, but was hemmed neatly in by fields of corn, row after row of corn, over undulating hills up to a ridge on the other side. Now, in the valley between forest and field, a housing developer decided to stick an exploratory finger, a cul-de-sac that he paved over and populated with half a dozen vintage Cape Cod houses. And he named it all Country View Estates. Hmm? And the people moved in and they were thrilled. It was wonderful. Why they could watch nature in all its beauty and drama unfolding right outside their eyes. And they could see the pageantry of the seasons roll by. Oh, it was exquisite, every season in its turn. So for example, in spring, while you could see corn just popping up out of the ground, green stripes with dark rain-soaked brown soil and green stripes, the whole affair looking like corduroy, undulating into folds up over the hill. And you could hear the birds. The birds, oh, they were territorial. The blue jays were the worst. They would squawk after other birds to find their nesting place. And then summer, of course, oh, the deep dark forest would issue forth a breath of cool, cool air, fragrant with honeysuckle from vines climbing up the trees, reaching toward the sun. And the children who were home from school could find treasures, a little half of a butterfly wing left trembling in a spider web, or a box turtle shell that was long ago abandoned and bone bleached white inside, but on the outside, well, the orange and black puzzle patterns were still there. And then, of course, there were fireflies, beautiful fireflies, luminous, iridescent, magnificent creatures of the night flying this way and that. And you could capture them and put them in a jar at night, incandescent spirits that the next day just looked like dead flies in the bottom of a jar. But at night, ooh, they were magnificent. And then fall, of course, it was all harvest home, the feeling of abundance and prosperity as they watched the farmers and their teams pull through harvesting all the corn, leaving the bone bleached stalks of corn stalks sticking up this way and that in the warm autumn sun, all the way up the hills. And the fat green leaves of summer withered and shrieked their colors of bright red and gold and orange and whisked, rattled off the wind, gone. And then winter would come and settle in on the winter bare branches of the trees of the forest, leaving snow on top and ice below, all of it sparkling, oh, like a mysterious, beautiful fairy tale would. And the deer and all their extra padding and the birds all fluffed out. They all looked like plush stuffed animals fluffed up against the frigid cold. It was a beautiful place to live. You could watch nature in all its facets. But then, of course, as happens frequently in paradise, something weird happened. It was the day after Halloween and the day before All Souls Day. And it was just at dusk. You see, the sun set over that ridge line of trees early so that it made the valley a gritty gray gloaming much before the rest of the landscape. And a dampness would seep in, and people would close their curtains early in this incoming winter. And they'd turn their backs on the windows and they'd sit and watch their televisions or they'd read. And one by one, each house had a very strange thing happen to them. You see, while they were watching TV or reading, they would hear banging up against the window behind the curtains. They'd hear the funniest sound. It was like a dum dum dum, tick tick tick, dum dum tick. Well, when they opened the curtains, they could see illuminated from the light behind them white, bobbling orbs like Japanese lanterns spinning on unseen axis, up and down, bouncing into each other like balloons, bouncing up against the window. And every one of them had one, maybe two, sometimes three painted puppy dog faces on them. They were silly, childlike things with little pink tongues and flippy ears and huge, moronic, slightly menacing eyes that seemed to look in at them. Bonk, 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 spin, bonk. What is the meaning of this? Well, the more fearful of them simply closed the curtains and pretended like they didn't see anything and went back to their television. But the braver of them ventured to turn on the porch light and open their door a crack. Who's there? But of course, there was nobody there then. There was nothing. And each in turn, every house was plagued by the strange puppy dog heads, and the people were texting each other, all the adults texting each other. Did you see that? What do you think that's about? So the last house in the cul-de-sac to be hit by the puppy dog heads was the Sampsons. And Mr. Sampson was ex military and he wasn't going to deal with this anymore. He was going to put an end to it. So his wife sat watching their favorite TV show, and behind her, the picture window and the curtains drawn. When she heard it, dum, 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 tick a dum, dum. She didn't open the curtains. She just looked at her husband and nodded. And he roared out of the front door with a flashlight in one hand and a baseball bat in the other. I've got you now. And what he got actually was a gaggle of teenagers. The young boys guffawing and laughing and pushing each other, and the girls snorting and giggling, and the whole raggedy affair ran off down the street into the darkness and were gone. I know you kids. I know your parents. I'm going to tell them, even though he actually didn't know any of them. Well, Mrs. Sampson came out and started texting the other adults who came out of their houses, and they stood under the spasmodic, flickering overhead streetlight that couldn't quite decide if it was day or night yet. And they looked, and there on the ground were the puppy dog heads. Well, they were light as air. Oh my. And when they looked in them, why, it was a single layer of chicken wire covered by a single layer of white tissue paper, painted with the most ridiculous faces, almost as translucent as the shed skin of a snake. What's the meaning of this? What's wrong with those kids? What a stupid idea. Why would they do this? And that's when somebody pointed between the houses, the opposite hill. Ooh, the cornfield was glowing brassy bright in the very last rays of the setting sun. And there were dogs running loose. Dogs running loose. Well, Mrs. Sampson was the first to say there's an ordinance against that. And Mr. Sampson said, you better get your dogs. And all of them grumbled, who's letting their dogs loose? And they watched, indignant, as the dogs ran up to the ridge line. That's when they realized they weren't dogs at all. They were they were wolves. Well, now it's one thing to live in the country view estates and see fluffy little deer and adorable little quail that go across the road. It's quite another thing to have wolves. They hadn't signed on for that. The wolves stood up on the ridge line, outlined against a cobalt darkening sky, but their eyes glittered in the very last shards of sunset, looking down at the adults in the darkened valley. There was silence for a moment. And then over the hill they went, yipping and howling with joy, galloping off into the dark and gone, leaving the adults standing there with their idiot puppy dog heads befuddled, feeling somewhat unmoored. Could it be that in this very strange time, before All Souls Day and after Halloween, that tear in the year when all the spirits and haunts come out and bother the living? Maybe it's possible that those teenagers had been bewitched and turned into wolves. And then some unbidden finger of honesty poked up at each one of them and said, maybe, maybe even stranger than teenagers being bewitched and becoming wild animals overnight. It maybe, maybe even more bewitching was all of us under the spell of our comfortable, cozy homes, somehow thinking that the drama of nature, with all its beauty and violence, and the churning seasons that never stop, that maybe that was all just a spectator show for their benefit, and that they themselves, you see, might remain unchanged and untouched. And as they stood pondering this, the gray chill of evening soaked up under their jackets, through their sweaters, and caused them to shiver. But it was the trembling inside, the trembling of autumn leaves fighting a losing fight against the wind. No, you're muted. You're still muted. There you are.
You know, Vicky, you don't just tell me stories. You really literally carry me along with you into that story.
Oh, I'm
And
glad.
the moon rises, the sun rises and sets. I mean, you have a duration of hours, and it's as if I am not only in the story with you, or you could be holding my hand along a pathway, but I'm seeing the light change. I'm
Mm,
hearing it's lovely. Thank you.
I'm glad.
So I've decided that I think it's time for me to tell you about growing up in December in our home in Oakland, California, near seminary, above what was then called Mills College,
Mhm.
adjacent practically to Mountain Boulevard, which is there now, but was overtaken by Highway 13, the Warren Freeway. But we are not outside. We are not near the freeway. We are in the house. That's the second to the last house at the top of the 1 block hill. A house my father built and finished in 1952. And it's Christmas Eve, and the family's doing what it normally does, and that is try to not be too excited, try to not look too rumpled, because we've had dinner and we've been decorating the tree. We've been trying to not get in trouble. And I'm among the oldest. For the youngest, it's an entirely different experience. When about 11 o'clock, it's nighttime, we are headed to midnight mass.
Uh-huh.
And at about, we ate dinner late for obvious reasons. And we've spent quite a lot of time fussing. And we think it's now time to get going. But it depends if you're one of the parents who's thinking, or one of the elder, like my twin and I were high school students.
Uh-huh.
And he was gone. He had left for the seminary. He was going to become a priest. So it was just my older brother, younger than myself, and my five, my four other sisters, my four sisters. And we we for some reason were out of sync. And because the time is now such that we've really got to finish looking presentable and with our coats and whatever it is we needed to get to midnight mass. So my mother's whispering in my ear, but you can believe we have more than one child in the family who still firmly believes and is still learning about Santa Claus. So she's the one who's the most excited. And she's the one who, when we get back from midnight mass, is going to be given what the family called the honors of putting, by this time, baby Jesus into the manger because he will have been born. And I think that put her in different sorts, excited sorts, but disturbing sorts, because between my parents and myself and my twin brother not being there this year, which was odd, transitioning from dinner to being dressed and to getting downstairs into the garage and into the back seat of the 9-passenger station wagon all had hurdles to hurdle that weren't getting hurdled quite right. And so grumpily down the stairs went everybody, and I helped get them in the car. But I knew that my mother still needed some help. And so I left them in the car, and it would be so easy if in 1963 we had the ability to text, although my siblings would have seen me doing it. And that would have been a different life. But because we're not in that, because we were in 1963, as soon as I helped get all 5 of my existing at the time siblings into the car, I went back upstairs to help my mom. And I would pour some milk in a clear glass and put it at the fireplace on the hearth. And I would half peel a tangerine and eat one of the segments and leave that there, because it was extremely important that when we came home and discovered our gifts that were under the tree that were brought by Santa Claus, that he had been there and that it was him, and we would know because the milk was drunk and the tangerine had been eaten. And that took extra time, mostly because while I'm trying to fix the hearth to look shipshape, Mom is struggling with some of the gifts and the we don't wrap, our family didn't wrap our gifts from Santa. They came unwrapped. And by the time that got put in place, and Mom and I headed downstairs, Dad, as you can imagine, has been cooling his heels behind the wheel of the station wagon, and he's opened the rear door and he's ready to put it in reverse and back out and get headed to church. And that's what we did. But by the time this happens, there's an out of sortsness that's affecting the whole trip to church. It was just on High and MacArthur in the Fruitvale in the Laurel District. It didn't take very long to get there. But there was some elbowing left and elbowing right, and some louder words and some harsher sounds, and it was not a usual Christmas Eve. And it was very difficult for everybody to understand what was going on. And it isn't clear to me to this day what went down that night, other than that my twin brother wasn't there for the one and only time. But when we came, so we arrive at church at St. Lawrence O'Toole's on High Street, and filing in through the center aisle and choosing a pew and making sure that there's enough spaces for all of us to fit our fannies and our coats. The church had already been warmed up and we didn't need our coats. So the pew was quite full even when we were not seated in it. There was a lot of paraphernalia. And the only two men in this picture of my story is my father and my younger brother, 6 years younger than me. And all of our four sisters, in addition to me, lined up. So it was a bit, it was a bit, it was like a bracketed picture where there are two men on the end. My father took the aisle because he needed to get out when it was time to collect the collection for the tithing. And then that was my father. And so my brother, he was on the inside of the pew, and my father was on the outside. And then there were these 5 females, 6 when you count my mom. And she was in the middle of the 8 people who were there, if you can have a middle in the number 8. And it was all that she could do to pay attention to what was going on in the whole space, because we were so focused in our living room on readying the evening, so focused in the car on not making distractions that would upset Dad, who was driving us, and so focused on getting inside the church that there was no attention paid to why we were there and what we were really doing while we were there. All that changed as soon as the most formal part of midnight mass began. You would think that choral singing and us joining in hymns and in holiday hymns would have done the trick, and that quieted us down somewhat. But what calmed us down was when the procession of Monsignor Coughlin and Father Cabral and the altar boys and acolytes followed up the center aisle toward the main altar with the frankincense and myrrh and the golden dispensers that Father Coughlin's arm would extend back and forth to create the sense motion. And when the smells of the I don't know if it was the frankincense or if it was the myrrh, but our olfactory senses seem to take over. And all of us in that row were calm and watching and listening and standing and kneeling in unison as the Mass's duration unfolded. And it was as if none of the excitement or disarray beforehand had existed, and we had entered this new realm of a high mass before the ecumenical council happened in the early 60s, whereby the priests would turn around and face us. In this high mass, the before time, We never really saw their faces because everything was to our backs and toward the tabernacle, toward the altar, toward where everything that was going on sometimes when we couldn't see. It would be behind the back and the strong wide shoulders of one of the anointed, and we just stayed in the quiet moment of believing and of being. And the the sense of the nose, because of the frankincense and myrrh, and the sense of the hearing because of caroling and hymns and tunes, that songs that we knew, even though we would sometimes go to the back of the pew in front of us and out of its little bookcase pull one of the hymnals or one of the songbooks. Nothing interrupted anything that had to do with our sense of smell or our sense of hearing. And that stayed with us until the end of Christmas, of midnight mass. And this is a church that held 2,000 people, if you included the choir loft. And I had been to over a dozen of these in my life. And in none of them do I ever remember being able to tell you about the details that didn't have to do with the sense of smell or the sound of song. And with this, our mass comes to an end, and everyone piles back into the car, and we stay calm for about as long as our family stayed calm, unless we were in a situation like I just described, which is not very long. Because on the way home, the sense of calm started to evaporate. And as we drove into the garage and got out of the station wagon and climbed the interior stairs back up into the house, we were all just thinking about presents, about Mom's fruitcake, about the Nanaimo bars that she baked, about drinking eggnog, and about opening presents. And for my younger siblings that still believed, about what Santa may or may not have brought. And so with this anticipation and our feet landing on the wooden oak floor of the hallway and rounding the corner of the philodendron-laden room divider boxes of brass, and the green philodendron leaves climbing wooden dowel poles that my father had planted there so that the philodendron would be happy, we look at the tree in all its glory, and what we see is the same manger that always lives underneath the wooden box that's covered in white flannel, but differently. There was something about this year that we'd forgotten all about. And it was that this was the first year we were going to let our youngest child, my youngest sibling, be the person who placed baby Jesus in his manger. And so I got to be the one to tell her she was going to be able to do this because I was her oldest sister. And it surprised her more than it surprised me that she was going to be able to be the person to place baby Jesus in the manger. but it didn't surprise her so much so that she wasn't able to do the formalities of carefully opening the box where the last small statue in this creche was to be unwrapped from its white cotton fabric, and then walked carefully across the wooden living room floor and carefully kneels down and gets under the tree and her hands into the creche and places the baby there, the infant, the baby Jesus. And I felt as if that was the first time that I had ever seen someone who's um, I don't let's see, she was born in the summer. She was at the most 3.5. And it was my first time seeing someone visibly change from being an upset or a impatient or a fidgeting little wiggly small person into someone, how do I put this, who who thought that she was now bigger and older, maybe wiser. She, because she turned around and she stood up, and all she wanted me to do, even before she opened some of her gifts, was to tell her, what did she ask me? To tell her what I thought about the wise men. Because she didn't realize that the wise men were the wise men because they were wise. But maybe it was something in the sermon. Maybe it was something as the entourage went down the center aisle of the church. But she said, Linda, what makes those men so wise? And will I be wise when I am older? And will I have gifts to give people? She was peppering me with questions. And I looked at her and I said, you know, Sandy, I don't have the answers to those questions. But I think that you are already wise to be asking these questions in the first place.
Mm.
And I smiled, and she smiled, and seamlessly went back to paying her attention to the tree and the gifts underneath it, and then took on her second job of the evening. I'll end there, but her second job of the evening was being able to pick up gifts and deliver them to everybody's lap whose name was on the tag of that box. So there you have a Wall's Christmas.
Oh, that was charming. That was really charming. So how old were you? About